Hello and welcome to the video. In this video, we're going to talk about two things. So one, why having at least a base level of cardiovascular fitness and doing some cardio will help you build more muscle. And two, how to structure your cardio for the sole purpose of facilitating better muscle growth. Now, if you don't know me already, my name is Zachary Keith. I'm the owner of Fitness Simplified. I'm a certified strength and conditioning specialist and sports nutritionist. I hold a bachelor's in exercise physiology and I'm a current student in physical therapy. I've worked one-on-one with people in a coaching manner, in person, remotely for the past 8 years or so. And my hope is that you use my free content to build a better understanding of fitness and get better results long term. So to clarify what I said before, so that you know that this video is worthwhile your time to spend watching it, what we're going to talk about is one, why cardio, having at least a base level of it, will help you build muscle more efficiently, and two, if how to structure cardio if you're a person who only cares about building muscle. So we're not going to talk about how to build high levels of cardiorespiratory fitness or really do both at a high level or anything like that. We're going to talk about how to structure your cardio for the sole purpose of supplementing and supporting better muscle growth. So let's dive right into topic number one, which is why having at least a base level of cardiovascular fitness will help you build more muscle. So it's first worth noting that cardio isn't going to directly help you build more muscle. And if you were to add a cardiovascular training program on top of an already existing strength training program, you're probably not going to see any immediate benefits. Rather, you should see it as more of a long-term investment. And what I mean by that is that it's not the cardio itself that is going to help you build more muscle more efficiently. It's being better at cardio that will. Now, in the research, there's a number of studies that currently look at this and support this idea. One of which that I think shows it the best is a 2022 study that came out of Dr. Stuart Phillips' lab. And what they did is they had their subjects perform a cardiovascular training program on one leg while the other leg stayed sedentary. They did that for 6 weeks and then did a strength training program using both legs. After that strength training program, they measured the amount of muscle growth that each leg experienced. And what they found is that the leg that did the cardiovascular training program experienced greater muscle growth than the one that stayed sedentary. Now, there's two main reasons why this would happen. So first, there's a number of different things that happen inside your body as you adapt to a cardiovascular training program, one of which is an increase in muscle capillary density. Now, for all intents and purposes, you can think of these muscle capillaries as the exit ramps from your main blood supply to the working muscle. So you can imagine if you were to compare two different highways with equal traffic, one of which had 5 exits that all cars can use, the other had 1 exit that all cars can use. You would imagine that the highway with 5 exits, the traffic would be easier, and it'd be easier for those cars to get off the highway than it would for the highway with 1 exit. And that's kind of the idea that is happening with this increase in muscle capillaries. Your blood, your oxygen, and your nutrients are better able to get from your main blood supply to the working muscle, which coincidentally is exactly what you need to facilitate better recovery. Of note, in that particular study, they did measure the muscle capillary density, the number of capillaries in each muscle, before and after the 6-week aerobic training program, and they found that the leg that did the cardiovascular training program experienced an increase in the number and the density of capillaries inside the muscle, while the sedentary leg did not experience that benefit. Another and seemingly more important point is that this increase in muscle capillary density leads to an increase in these things called satellite cells. Now, satellite cells are kind of like your stem cells within the muscle, and a stem cell is essentially a cell that can do many different things or turn into many things and serve many different functions. These satellite cells in the muscle, they serve very important roles in terms of muscle repair, muscle growth, things like that. So you can imagine after a workout where you cause a little bit of damage to your muscles that those would be rather important. In line with this, it does seem to be the case that a person's ability, so to speak, to build muscle is rather closely tied to the amount of satellite cells that they have within the muscle. Similar to the increase in muscle capillary density, they did see an increase in the number of these satellite cells in the muscle, which also contributed to the increase in muscle growth that the participants saw throughout the 10-week strength training program. There's a number of other studies that have suggested this idea, this relationship, all of which I will link in the video notes, the description box, the show notes, whatever you want to call it, down below. So you're welcome to check that out if you would like. Nevertheless, there's two main points that you should take from that. So one, it wasn't necessarily the cardio itself that helped people build muscle. On the 6-week aerobic training program, they didn't build muscle during that. They did, however, become more prone to build muscle once they had the adaptations from the cardiovascular training program. Another thing to keep in mind is that these benefits were site specific, meaning that it wasn't that it was to the whole body, it was to the leg that did the cardiovascular training program. We're going to talk about this a bit more, but it does provide some rationale to the idea that you want to cardiovascularly train the entire body and not just the legs, which generally get the bulk of it. So now with that said, let's start talking about how to structure your cardio for the sole purpose of building more muscle. Now, again, just for clarity's sake, I am going to make other videos about how to, build both at a high level if you want to build high levels of cardiovascular fitness and high levels of strength, which I would argue for most people is your best bet. But just for the purposes of this sort of topic at hand, what we're going to talk about is how to do cardio as a supplemental thing, let's say, for strength training. Now, in order to do this most effectively, there's two things that we need to focus on. So one, we don't want to elicit high amounts of fatigue. And two, we don't want to create high amounts of muscle damage. From a program design standpoint, these are really the only two features of a cardiovascular exercise that can provide any sort of interference to a strength training program. Now, in order to accomplish that, there's three things we want to focus on. So one, we want to use the most effective modality. Two, we want to use the right intensities. And three, we want to train at the right dose. And that can be split up into total weekly volume and total weekly frequency. So let's go ahead and go in that order. So first thing to get right is the right intensity. What I would recommend is to do all your cardio at what's called a zone 2 intensity. Now, zone 2 is kind of a messy definition. You'll see different definitions for it across the internet. For these purposes, all you need to do to gauge whether you're at a zone 2 intensity or not is to use something called the talk test. Now, the talk test is something where as you're performing the exercise, you would try to say a 10-word sentence. If you can not say that 10-word sentence without gasping for air, you're going too hard and you need to slow down. What you should be able to do is say that 10-word sentence, but if you pushed a little bit harder, you would therefore not be able to. You want to be right at that edge, and that's the intensity you want to be at. If you're interested in what zone 2 actually is and who it's important for, I will dedicate another video to that because that can be a whole discussion. But let's get back to the topic at hand. Now, the purpose of training at that intensity is that one, it is intense enough to elicit real cardiovascular adaptations, but two, it is not so intense that you're going to feel beat up throughout the following day or be sore the next day or anything like that. You're not going to experience any real fatigue or experience any muscle damage. So number 2 on that list was modality. And in other words, what actual exercise should you do? Now, for the purposes of limiting fatigue and muscle damage, there is 2 things you want to focus on when choosing an exercise. So one, you want to choose one that does not have any eccentric loading. And 2, you want to choose one that has a low amount of impact. Now, eccentric loading is the enlarging of a joint angle, the lengthening of a muscle, or, more simply said, the lowering of a weight. So if you were to imagine a bicep curl, as you were lowering that weight, that part of the rep would be the eccentric portion. As you actually lifted the weight up, that is the concentric portion. And then impact is impact. So anytime you impact with the floor. And an easy example of that is to compare and contrast running and cycling. So if you're riding a bike, there's never really any sort of impact. You're just kind of your foot is always attached to what it is working against. Where with running, you are constantly impacting on the ground. Now, again, that's not to say that you cannot build high levels of running ability and build strength. You certainly can. I will cover that in another video. But for our purposes, for the sole purpose of using cardio to supplement muscle building, it's not the best choice, in my opinion. Using cycling as another example of why it's a good choice to avoid eccentric loading, you are always performing a pushing action, if you think about it. Either you're pushing down on the pedal or you're pulling your leg up if you have the cage on the pedal. But nevertheless, it is always a pushing action. You're never lowering a weight when you're on a cycler or a bike. And now again, though, remember, the benefits of the increased capillary density are site-specific. So it is best to choose cardiovascular exercises in which the entire body is trained. And some examples of that most gyms have these days are something like an Airdyne or an air bike, whatever you want to call it, a Concept 2 rower, a skier, great for the upper body, a swimming, great for the upper body. Swimming and a skier can be, not quite nicely paired with cycling if you do half your volume on one, half your volume on the other. Nevertheless, any of those or anything similar would probably be your best bet as far as what actual exercise you should do. So we've covered how intense you should perform the exercise, and in other words, how hard you should try. We've covered what actual exercises you should do. Now let's talk about the dose, and in other words, how much you should do per week and how you should split that up throughout the week, or in other words, your frequency. Now, as far as dose goes, there's really no way for me to best answer this without knowing you in the in the context of a video like this. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to imagine that, for the avatar at hand, we're going to imagine they are someone who either does or does not do strength training, but definitely does not do any aerobic or cardiovascular. For this individual, I usually recommend something very light, something very easy to just kind of get into it and start, building familiarity and getting used to it. So, something like 40 minutes per week would be a good starting point for most people. And again, that's not a hard, fast number. There's no way for me to give you a hard, fast number, but it would make a good general starting point for most people. As far as how to progress this, because remember, you're not really progressing the intensity, you're only going to progress the dose you do, the total weekly duration you do. Something you can do that works for most people is to add 10 minutes per week to that total weekly dose. So week 2, you would do 50 minutes, week 3, 60 minutes, week 4, 70 minutes, and so on. Now, how far you go with that is entirely up to you. There's no real sort of benchmark I can really give you. I would say that a minimum of aiming for 90 minutes per week is not a bad idea. One, that's going to make sure you meet physical activity guidelines, which is a good idea. And 2, at 90 minutes, you're very likely to get all of the benefits of, cardio as a transfer over to muscle building. So I would say that's your minimum, but if you want to take that farther, that's totally, your prerogative. Now, the second component within the dose of cardio that you apply is the frequency. In other words, how do you split up that total weekly dose across the week? And the answer to that is that it is 100% up to you. So let's say, imagine you are at that 90-minute mark and you're staying there. Whether that is 2 45-minute sessions, 1 90-minute session, 3 30-minute sessions, probably does not matter at all. So I would say whatever works better for you, your preferences, your schedule, anything like that, that is probably going to be your best bet, because whatever is most easiest, I was poor grammar, for you to adhere to is what the right answer to that is. So with that said, that's everything that I was hoping to cover in this video. I hope that you found this helpful and, maybe got something good out of this. If you would like my most practical, concise, actionable, and free help, I would encourage you to check out the Fitness Simplified Fridays newsletter, which I will link down below. And with that said, I'm going to end that here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.